this video, we're going to be looking at Ilford HP5 pushed to 1600. When I did my initial review for Ilford HP5, I saw that it had a ton of shadow detail, so I knew that it would be a good film for pushing. If you're not familiar with pushing film, it's essentially underexposing and then extending the development time to compensate for that underexposure. In the case of this image, I exposed for this area at a zone 3. If we were to push the film 2 stops, that zone 3 would actually render around a zone 1 on the film. An important thing to note about pushing film is that you're not gaining sensitivity, you're actually losing it when you push. So this image that was exposed exactly the same is actually 2 stops darker. That's not to say that it's necessarily a bad thing, it's just something that you need to be aware of. In fact, you might actually say that this image looks better than the regular one. I pushed the film in 2 different developers to get a more well-rounded idea of how the film would react pushed overall. So I used XTOL at 1:2 and HC110 dilution B. I found the results to be pretty similar in both, so I don't feel the need to compare them, but XTOL had slightly better shadow detail, but it is a speed increasing developer, so that's to be expected. Starting with the shadow detail, I wasn't really surprised by the results from HP5 because knowing how much shadow detail this film has, I knew that it would be able to keep up, but I was actually impressed with how good it did hold up. I exposed really intensely with this one. I exposed for a zone 3 on a 2 stops push, so I was actually in reality rendering for a zone 1, and you could still see plenty of shadow detail in the image here. Of course, if you did try to lift the shadows, they would definitely be grainy and muddy, but the fact that it did hold detail was pretty impressive. When it comes to pushing your film, the image is always going to be grainier. The extended development time increases the size and density of the silver grains, so you're going to end up with a much grittier image. In the case of HP5, which is a relatively fine-grained film for being 400, I think the grain is not too intense. It's definitely more present, but it still has a nice aesthetic to it. Whenever you're doing something out of the ordinary with your film, like pushing, your results aren't going to be optimal, but some films will hold up better than others. In the case of the highlights, I found that HP5 does retain highlight detail pretty well even though it's pushed. The highlight density is definitely much higher, but I feel like there's still enough information there for you to pull those highlights back and still retain some detail. Normally I think it's best to shoot your film at box speed and you'll end up with the best results, but also knowing that you can push HP5 to its absolute limits and still retain a lot of detail, I think is a very reassuring feeling. So I think if you were to push HP5, whether it be for necessity because of low light or just because of aesthetics, I think it would definitely have your back. What are your guys' thoughts on pushing HP5? Have you ever done it before? And after seeing this video, would you consider it? Let me know in the comments, and we'll see you guys next time on The Negative.